Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Emerging Technologies and Creativity Research Lab Speaker Series. We have this every last Wednesday of the month. And for our April speak, I'm really excited to have Dr. Remi here with us, who is, I can probably read the whole bio about his accomplishment.
Don't read it.
But I think just briefly, what I like to do is that I like to avoid introducing people and have them introduce themselves in the way that they want to be heard. So I think that's what I'm going to default to. But my excitement here is really with the work that Remi does around social annotation. And he wrote a book on it, of course, and has been a scholar in this space. So I'm going to do that bad of an introduction, so that way he can actually introduce himself in a more full way. He's coming from to us from the University of Colorado's Denver School of Education and Human Development, and he's an associate professor in the learning design and technology. And he'll be talking to us through, of course, the title of his talk is The Critical and Sociotechnical Practices of Annotation, which is a mouthful, so he's going to break that down for us. So, but let me just pause here and say welcome to everybody who is joining us on the webinar. Please feel free to chat in the chat window by introducing yourself, just saying hello and where you're joining us from. In the chat window, click on the drop down so that it's just everyone instead of just to the host, so everybody can see who everybody is. And with that, let me just give it back to Remi and say, Remi, thank you so much for agreeing to join us here today. And we are looking forward to learning more about you, the work that you do, and specifically around creativity, annotations, and so forth. So welcome.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Tulani. It is a pleasure to join you today. As has been said, my name is Remi Kalir. I'm an associate professor at the University of Colorado in Denver. Today, I'm joining you from the ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Ute people. I'm also joining you from a university campus that is involved in current acts of recognition and reparation around the fact that our campus physically was built through an act of displacement and the displacement of the agrarian neighborhood. And so recognizing the complex histories of place that allow me the privilege of being with you today. And I just want to be very clear about that. Tulani, you and I have gone back and forth at various academic conferences and in shared academic spaces and circles for quite a few years now. And so it's really an honor to join you and your students. It's really wonderful to connect. And I hope that today is a fruitful, provocative conversation about a topic that I care deeply about, which is the practice of annotation, and something that I anticipate the folks who are in the room, the folks who are online, that you are all annotators, that you all add notes to texts as you read the word and as you read the world. And I'm excited to talk with you a little bit about that today. And so this is going to be, I anticipate, pretty informal. We were just talking a little bit about kind of structure and how I might begin. And so what I'd like to do, if it's okay, is spend maybe the first 10 minutes giving a pretty high-level overview to some of my thoughts about what annotation is, some of the kind of creative and emerging and important topics around annotation. And that will hopefully spark and inspire some thoughts about whether it's the technologies or the practices or the complexities of this thing called annotation. So if that sounds okay, we'll dig in for about 10 minutes and then we'll just maybe free form a little bit and share some examples and talk and open it up for questions. Does that all sound okay for everyone? Yeah? Okay, wonderful. Well, let me start then by sharing my screen. And can everyone see this presentation? Can I get a quick thumbs up from folks? Are you able to see this Google screen if I go into my slideshow mode? Let me make sure that I'm in the right place. I think, let me try that one more time, folks, apologies. Participants can now see this. So can you all see this? And is it in slideshow mode or is it still a little small?
Still in the regular mode.
Let me, sorry for the quick technical, for some reason, this is, okay, let's try that again. Okay, let's share here. That looks a little bit better.
There we go, yeah.
Okay, thanks folks, good. Well, let's dive in and let's start here with a incredibly, I think, provocative image and a statement that I hold near and dear, which is that I am an annotator. And this is an image of a stamped $20 bill that some people refer to as a Tubman 20. And it uses this very important technology, which is the technology of a stamp. And this is an annotation technology. It's also interactive media. This is a form of reader response. And this particular stamp is a portrait of Harriet Tubman and was created by an artist in response to an announcement during President Obama's administration that Harriet Tubman might replace President Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. Now, during the previous administration, that process of redesigning currency that we use every day was put on hold. And so as an act of creative resistance and as an act of restoring this everyday object, an artist 3D printed using open source code this stamp to then put Tubman's portrait superimposed on a $20 bill. Now, I see this as an incredibly provocative, contemporary, both handheld, but also, again, a 3D printed stamp, and also a digital example of how we are all involved in everyday acts of annotation. So with that as a provocative start, let me say that again, I read, I write, and I write about annotation every day. And I'm currently involved in a variety of projects, but one celebration of everyday annotation that I happen to like quite a bit is a project I'm running right now called Annotate 22, which you can find out more about online through my website. But every day this year, for 365 days, I'm sharing an example of annotation in a book, in the built environment, somewhere around us, to remind all of us, you in the room, you online, that you are a participant in acts of annotation on a regular basis. So what does that look like? Well, to me, it can look like this. And this is an image that I've had in my mind for, well, ever since I saw it in the New York Times on June 10th, 2020, almost 2 years ago. In response to a series of civic protests, calls for racial justice and reckoning following the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, this was Lafayette Square, the park that immediately sits next to the White House. And this is a fence that was famously erected around the White House during those protests to keep citizens away from that particular seat of government. And so in response, people began to, as I would read it, annotate this wall, this fence, this public canvas that became a space for dialogue. And so we see here in this photograph a student who's, at least to me, looks about the age of students that I used to teach. I used to be a middle school teacher, and then I became a high school teacher in New York City public schools. And that is a young gentleman by the name of Zayden Cuevas. And that may be his mother or an aunt or maybe an older sister. She's not named the relation in the article, but her name is Angelica Cuevas. So here we see Zayden and Angelica Cuevas reading these messages, reading this wall, participating in acts of civic engagement as they look at what I see as examples, again, of everyday annotation. And I want to use this as a bit of a mentor text to speak again creatively and provocatively about the kinds of technologies, including things like stamps and cardboard and paint, but also other digital technologies that help us to understand annotation, and use this mentor text to introduce some key ideas about my understanding of annotation, particularly as it's both a social practice and also a critical practice. And that again begins with the understanding that we read, write, and learn with notes that are added to texts. And those texts might be books, but those texts might also be broader social and political narratives. Now, again, many of you are probably most immediately familiar with annotation in reference to something like a cookbook. These are cookbooks that I own, that are annotated, that while we make recipes and adjust them and create food for our friends or family, we annotate things like cookbooks. We might also, of course, annotate our academic texts. And I think, again, many of you, whether it's in a idiosyncratic way or in a maybe more formal way using a social annotation technology, many of you are probably familiar with the annotations of texts in a more academic and formal context. But again, I also see annotation here. The Berlin Wall, of course, being an incredible example of notes that were added to that particular text. And also, again, more recently, things like digital projections that accompanied handwritten graffiti and murals and paints that are then restorying, in this case, Confederate monuments. We have a source text, perhaps in this case, 100 years old, now remediated with contemporary messages, changing the way in which people interpret these particular signs and symbols, again, all around us in the built environment. Of course, a lot of my work concerns annotation here. Again, annotation in books and annotation in more formal academic settings, to me, is a reminder that this is an everyday literacy practice. And a lot of my research right now is at the intersection of literacy education and literacy research, a little bit of influence from the learning sciences, of course, and certainly my work with educators as a teacher educator, coming again from my own background in the K-12 classroom. And that brings us back here to Zayden and to Angelica Cuevas and to their reading of this annotated environment and how I understand this in the nature of my work. One of the things that I understand is that annotation is intertextual. It's a way of bringing multiple texts into conversation with one another. And so this particular sign I find very fascinating. If we can flatten the curve, we can bend the arc. And so here we see an intertextual reference to both flattening the curve, the COVID curve, which at the time, of course, we were in the first few months of what has been now a 2-year-long pandemic, a public health pandemic, but also bending the arc, referencing Dr. King's famous quote about the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice. We also see annotation as multimodal. Again, moving across multiple modalities, be it spoken, be it written, be it in this case a visual reference. This is what democracy looks like, says the sign, pointing to other signs, and also that being itself a protest chant. This is what democracy looks like, having Zayden and Angelica Cuevas there in the moment. Annotation is also dialogic, and I won't get too deep into some of the heteroglossic influences here and, folks like Mikhail Bakhtin and influences there, but I would say that there is here multiple forms of socially situated narrative and dialogue occurring between, for example, discourses around Black Lives Matter, discourses around humanity, discourses around the idea of who is essential, whose histories and stories and narratives are, of course, welcome and valued. And interestingly enough, now nearly 2 years after this photograph was taken, we're now seeing some of those kind of dialogic interpretations turned into pretty restrictive policy in the educational space as we look at laws that are being passed in certain states around curtailing curricula and delimiting whose histories and narratives can be taught. And so here we're seeing again a kind of dialogic restoring of that through, in this case, the medium of annotation. And it's also counter-narrative. And this to me is a very important affordance of annotation. There's an artist by the name of Alexandra Bell, whose work I find incredibly inspiring. And she has looked at the racialized and gendered ways in which annotation allows her art to reframe and re-narrate media headlines and media narratives. And I think that that's an important perspective to bring to these everyday acts of annotation. And so this is how I understand my approach to annotation. It's what my dear colleague and friend, Antero Garcia, and I wrote about in our book, Annotation. It came out just about a year ago, that we see annotation, whether it's in a formal educational space or whether it's in a kind of civic, participatory, more political space, as being this everyday literacy practice that is intertextual and multimodal and dialogic, and that can serve the function of counter-narrative particularly well. And so I'll just wrap up with a few concluding thoughts here, and then we should really open this up for reactions and questions and just take this in a variety of different directions. But I just really want to emphasize the fact that you add your notes to texts as a way of sharing commentary and sparking conversation, and that you likely do that in some form nearly daily, or that you see examples of that, certainly whether it's again around a built environment, in a newspaper, or on social media. And I have to, as we're at the end of the semester here, say that memes are an incredible example of annotation, of a note added to a text. And I know that the students that I teach right now this week are completing their course evaluations of me and the classes I taught this semester. And I have to laugh because these kinds of memes are great examples of everyday annotation, quickly authored, shared socially, relevant to particular communities and contexts, and that showcase again these everyday literacies associated with annotation, which is of course ultimately a digital media. And so whether you're writing by hand in a book, whether you're sharing information digitally online, annotation is one of the original digital mediums, and it literally has embraced that practice for centuries. And it's also participatory. It's a means by which people join and participate in and document their dialogue. So I'm going to just leave my very brief set of introductory comments there. I have as well just a whole host of examples and projects that we can dig into, but that's the spark. And perhaps then we can open this up through questions and comments and example. Thank you so much for letting me share a little bit with you this morning.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was very insightful. So I'm going to take host liberties and start asking a few questions, just for clarity before we open up to other people to come in. I was hearing a few things in your talk that I want to make sure that I understand correctly. Is it fair to say that annotation at its simplest is a way of adding text to something to explain? Or is that too simple of a
no? In fact, I actually really appreciate the need for incredibly simple definitions, because I think that allows us to then be more expansive and open the opportunity for interpretation. In our book, Antero and I define annotation simply as a note added to a text. 6 words. A note added to a text. And as you mentioned, historically, annotation has explained. That's a key affordance of annotation. When we look back, for example, at manuscripts written hundreds of years ago, let's say medieval Europe, explanation was a really key affordance of annotation. Words needed to be translated from one language into another. In some cases, mistakes needed to be corrected. In a few other instances, connections could be made in, again, that intertextual way between multiple texts or even versions of texts. And so a key example of annotation is explanation or providing information, as I like to say. And some of the terminology that is a little bit more, well, dare I say, scholarly and very particular actually uses that, like, so for example, the word gloss, which is probably familiar to most of you, and we even use it colloquially. Oh, you glossed over that point, right? Or you glossed over some idea. It also, of course, informs the word glossary. That's an example of literal acts of annotation in 100-year-old manuscripts, providing very basic explanation, as you said, or information about keywords. And when all those glosses get put together, you end up with the thing that a lot of us find in the back of books, which is a glossary, right? And so we see that this language of annotation has been with us for hundreds of years. But I completely agree with you. It is very important to start with incredibly simple definitions and then say, well, if annotation is a note added to a text, what counts as the note? And what counts as the text? And where is it happening? Is it only happening in books? Probably not. Is it happening during a protest? Is it happening on money? Is it happening digitally in our learning environments? Yes to all of those questions. What's it look like then?
It sounds, the example that you were giving, the one other takeaway that I'm having here is the notion of participation that you talked about. Annotation is participation. And what that participation looks like is up to discussion, right? It could be the protest itself is a form of participation. But is annotation more associated with protest, or is it too limiting to put it that way?
No, and in fact, what I would say is part of what I want to focus on is that annotation leaves a trace. We want to have that evidence. When we add a note to a text, we see evidence of that interaction. And so many of you, again, whether you're in the room or you're online, you've very likely written in a book. Now, we can have a debate for a long time about whether that's okay. Whose books can you write in? Can you write in a library book? Nonetheless, particularly in academic settings, it is, dare I say, customary to mark up the margins of texts that you read. Now, in many cases, that's a private activity. When I'm reading a book and I'm making sense of it, I'm often writing notes to myself. And in a lot of instances, annotation, that participatory act, is for an audience of one. It's private. And yet, I'm increasingly curious about the conditions under which annotation becomes social, in which those annotations are shared. And so when we see, for example, that picture of that fence, and we see people then putting their notes on that fence and putting their notes in conversation with other notes, and then seeing a young child, a school-aged child, reading those notes, we've now entered a circumstance where the annotations have become social. We're not only writing private notes in the margins of a book, we're writing public messages that are meant to be, dare I say, pedagogical. They're meant to send a message. They're meant to engage a young learner like Zayden Cuevas, who he's maybe participating in some kind of civic activity, and a small piece of going to the National Mall, going to the White House, being in that moment, is that he's reading, and his reading is social, and his reading is being mediated by these acts of annotation that are allowing him access to these types of narratives and counter narratives that for him may hold great meaning.
Hmm. I'm sensing agency in what you're saying,
Yes.
right? Like that I can pick up books on what Africa is supposed to be like, and I can edit and say, no, that's not correct. You know, I was reading a thesis from a scholar in Finland who changed the name of ethnic groups in Namibia because it didn't fit what they wanted to. I said, well, I can't make sense of this. I'm going to create a new word. And for me, I had to edit. I was like, no, by changing the name of that ethnic group, you kind of destroyed a lot of the cultural thing. So is there sort of a sense of agency, especially from students, that's associated with annotation?
Absolutely. And I'm just putting a link before I forget into the chat and we can come back to it. But you're absolutely right. When we encounter texts, we may have lived experience, we may have cultural knowledge, we may be connected to other ways of knowing that is in opposition to and rightfully needs to contest the presumed authority of an author. You're absolutely right. And annotation, again, is one way of making visible and providing a trace of that resistance, or again, that restoring. And that might get us to the example I just shared here, but let's hold off on that for a second here, because of course, you're absolutely right. In a classroom context, there is a lot of power negotiation that occurs if we then say to our students, hey, by the way, here's a text that we'd like you to read. What are the purposes for us to read it? Are we reading it for the purposes of textual interpretation? Are we reading it for the purposes of literary analysis? Are we reading it for the purposes so that you can collaboratively make meaning together? Or are we reading this text because it's actually quite problematic? And we might use annotation to provide a sense of ground truth, a sense, again, of counter-storying what has been presumed to be this particular interpretation, this particular author's take on it. And we need to provide our annotations in response, which is then maybe a very quick link to what I just put in the chat, which is a really fascinating example of what someone kind of off the cuff described as hate annotating, which is that this particular poem from 1764 called The Sugar Cane is about the Caribbean sugar plantations. And today, in a contemporary context, we might, and I say we here in a very particular sense, exactly, thanks, Nate, I see in the chat. There are folks who would read this poem as being incredibly racist, incredibly out of touch, extremely problematic, that, many years later, in very different cultural contexts, we can look back at a piece of literature and realize that it is incredibly flawed in a variety of ways. And so a group of scholars, this was last fall, put together a public kind of annotation activity where they made publicly accessible a digital version of this poem. And you can, as you see here, you can link to the full text of this poem. And as I look at it right now, there are 220 some odd public annotations that have been digitally layered on top of this version of the poem by scholars, by critical readers, by people who are interpreting this through a much more informed lens or series of lenses today. And again, this is organized by a group of scholars who have for quite a few years now actually been running both open annotation activities, open source journals, and making kind of alternative interpretations of history publicly available to other scholars through this type of resource. And so I share this as an example that really captures what you just said and makes this resource publicly available for others to be more informed and more critically conscious consumers of this type of literature.
I have two last questions before I start hogging the mic. But one is to sort of bring us to the emerging technology component of the speaker series.
Yes.
I can't help but think of Twitter as probably the biggest annotation space that we have right now.
It is. It is.
So I wonder if we can maybe just reflect on that a little, because I think there's both. There is the initial post, which I guess could count as an annotation if you view Twitter as a space on its own.
Exactly.
But then there's also something else that, I can respond to Simon's post and now annotate on top of that. So
yes.
I'd like for you to guys just share a little bit about that. But if I can pretend to be provocative, I can also say maybe, are you worried that the new ownership might interrupt some of that? So.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, let's not ignore the broader kind of social media, Twitter aside. All the various platforms have never been "quote unquote" safe spaces, particularly for folks who don't look like me, right? And I just think we need to be very aware of the stakes of engagement and the fact that it often requires people who have, incredibly, deft means of navigating these spaces to not encounter incredible amounts of harm. So we cannot ignore that in talking about whatever particular platform. Now, yes, of course, and I see Simon in the chat here is saying this, yes, Twitter is probably a incredibly provocative, but also problematic example of kind of annotation as a platform, right? Because we kind of also say that like Twitter has its own source code. And so any tweet is itself already a note that has been added to whatever code is essentially running this entire platform. Of course, quote tweets and replies in threads are deepening the ways in which we see this kind of layered discourse occurring. Yes, exactly. This session has just become an annotation on Twitter. Of course it has, and I hope that's the case. And I'll jump back into that space at another time. I would say that actually the platform that I am most fascinated with at the moment, the social media platform, when I bring an annotation lens to that space, is TikTok. I'm probably watching way too much TikTok for my own well-being at this point. Hours and hours of TikTok every week, because the act of the production of video is itself often annotated. Again, if you've watched even one or two videos on TikTok, you likely notice that the authors of the videos will add text into the video itself. In some cases, videos have no one narrating. The dialogue is actually entirely in text, or maybe there's a soundtrack. And again, there's these elements in kind of post-production that are quickly added to essentially the video recording. And then, of course, like other social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, you have all of the social discourse around the original post. And so you have all of the reactions and the likes and the shares and all of that as well. But to me, what I find fascinating about Twitter is it's a very good example of the text-based affordances of annotation, as many people are participating in that public square. Although again, this week in particular, that's become a very hot button interpretation of whatever Twitter means. In terms of the multimodal aspects of annotation, it's all on TikTok. And the kind of future, especially in terms of your lab's interest in creativity and aesthetic interpretations and expression, that to me is all happening on TikTok right now, and is again just a really fascinating space to watch and to think about.
I'm always fascinated at two things. One, at how many people do not think they're creative. When I don't think such a person exists. I think we're all creative in so many different ways. And how creative people are in these sort of emerging spaces. I wonder if you're able to maybe even just share some instance of creativity when it relates to annotation that have really sort of left a mark on you.
That's a really good point. I mean, I think that the creativity for me is maybe how the simplicity of the action, of the simplicity of the annotation gets wrapped up in so many other kinds of practices. Let me give the example that happened this past summer where a reader found a used book. It was a book of poetry by Charles Bukowski, who is himself a kind of very problematic poet for all kinds of reasons. And the reader of this used copy found that this copy was all marked up and that the original reader had added her annotations all throughout the poetry. And it was very, very kind of like, no, you're wrong, and I don't like this, and I'm going to kind of reject, like just like really, really like, going back at the poet. And at the time, those annotations were very likely written, again, for an audience of one. They were private. And yet when that book found its way to a used bookstore and then found its way halfway across the country and was then picked up by another reader, that new reader took out her phone, began to photograph all those annotations, put them on Twitter in some long thread, and of course it went viral. And some of you may have seen that particular thread. And it just launched all kinds of conversations around marginalia and sharing notes and talking back to the author. And so to me, the creativity comes first, again, with the simplicity that we write in books, just as much as we also write around ourselves, the world. But when we find ways of taking that book marginalia and then taking the handwritten digital and making it digital on social media, and then turning it into conversation, it really becomes something where that whole experience is greater than the sum of its individual parts, right? It's greater than just you writing in the margins of your book. And that to me says a lot about how these kind of emerging technical practices, they have historical antecedents of handwritten notes, but they're also mediated by today's technologies like social media, like Twitter. And it's the combination of those two that I find really provocative and really interesting.
I usually buy used books on Amazon by sorting for the one that's in best condition. But I think now after this session, I'm gonna go to the one that's most beat up so that I can actually see what people have annotated.
Exactly.
So let me pause here and give an opportunity to anybody who's on the call in the lab to ask questions. Please feel free to raise your hand and come up. I'll just start promoting everybody to panelists to come on. If you don't feel comfortable, that's okay. But it's a much better conversation when it involves a few more people. Simon, that was just you trying to run away, but but thank you for being here. But I'll just promote people to panelists, and you're not required to, but if you can come up and contribute, that would be great. In the meantime, I'll leave it to people in the lab. If anybody has any questions, comments. Otherwise, I'll become a teacher and start calling names. So. Has there, everybody who's coming up, please feel free to just unmute and have a conversation. Has there been a climb in, I don't know how to phrase it, but almost like incidents of annotation as more technologies have come up? Because if I think of graffiti as sort of the original annotation, especially like in the 90s and 80s, in the US at least, now a lot of that is happening in a virtual space. Is there more annotation than less, or are you seeing a pattern anywhere?
I don't know if there's more or less. It'd be hard to maybe, what I can say, there's certainly more platforms and more technology, certainly in formal spaces. And so what I just dropped into the chat, dear colleague Janae Cohn and I just wrote a short op-ed for Heschinger's, the journalism outlet. And we're really trying to focus in on the fact that this idea of social reading, of reading together, of being in community, particularly in formal online academic spaces, that has certainly amplified quite a lot over certainly the past 5, if not 10 years. So much of, again, I know we're talking to folks who are in doc programs, in graduate school. Our classes are hybrid. We're teaching and learning online. We might be instructing in our own classrooms where acts of quote unquote social reading are happening very frequently now, whether it's through open educational resources or whether it's through more specific social annotation tools and platforms. And there are a few prominent examples of that. And so there has certainly been a rise in that space. There has certainly been an incredible acceleration of social annotation as a formal academic practice. And again, a lot of my empirical research is living in that space. And so as that amplifies, we need to be, again, critically conscious, both consumers and also practitioners of the technologies that ensure that our students do so in ways that respects their privacy, that doesn't surveil them, that allows them to annotate as informally and creatively as we've been discussing, while also still making sense of their academic texts. And that's some of the kind of core argumentation that Janae and I put forth in this short piece, and that just came out last month. So there's definitely an increase there. And because there's an increase there, we need to just be, again, as educators, as classroom instructors, as researchers, very careful about the tools that we choose to use.
Should we be promoting annotation as a matter of classroom practice?
Well, I think that's part of the argument I want to make, which is that it's probably already happening in your classrooms, right? Like, I think that if we were to start asking our students, how do you read the text that I assign to you if I'm an educator, right? It's probably already happening in, again, informal ways. There are, of course, opportunities, and folks may know that I have a long-standing relationship with the social annotation organization Hypothesis, which develops an open source tool and really vibrant professional learning community around social annotation. So we're certainly seeing that there are instances and technologies and organizations that can say, hey, we know that it's already happening. Your students are probably already annotating. And so what if we make that a more formal course activity? What if we bring forth both the technology, but also the pedagogy that's helpful in creating then a much more supportive opportunity for that to occur as a way to introduce students to new disciplinary contexts, or content, excuse me, have them make meaning together, collaboratively, interpret texts. And that's very much possible because, again, I think it's already happening.
Again, I think I've brought up a lot of people onto the stage. If you're not up as a panelist and you want to come up, just raise your hand. But I think I've promoted everybody.
Awesome.
But I'm hoping that this can stop being me talking. Clement, you have a question? Okay, please.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's good to imagine that you've taken me from the ordinary level that I used to understand annotation to very, very in-depth level. But I'm a bit curious. Dr. Asido talked about an agency before now. I don't know, is there a way, and you talked about bringing it into the classroom as well, is there a way we can judge good or bad, or are there a way of knowing if annotations are properly done? Maybe coming from the teacher part of me.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Thank you for asking that, because when Ontario and I were writing our book, we got some really useful, we of course made the draft of the book open and got a whole bunch of commentary or annotation about what we were discussing. And some of our reviewers said, like, well, hold on a second. People are going to mark up books and they're going to just write whatever they want to write. They're going to just, star things, or they're going to write, they're going to swear at the author, or they're going to just say things that aren't productive. Absolutely. And so I am very interested, when I put on my more empirically oriented hat as a researcher, around the annotations, as you said, that are productive, that are useful for, in this case, students to generate knowledge together, right? And so I've had the honor over the past few years of collaborating with a small team in Canada that's been looking at how undergraduate students across multiple disciplines, like a gender and women's studies class, a publishing class, like a gerontology class, how undergraduates in all these different disciplines, when they were using social annotation technology and they were having conversations together, how were they constructing knowledge, if at all? Were those annotations actually useful in productive dialogue? Is social annotation essentially a way to spark useful online learning? And our most recent paper was actually just published last month. Let me bring it up here. And I think it is one response to your very important question, because it shows us that, and I just put the link in the chat, it shows us that in certain circumstances, when we look at a large corpus of annotations, in this case, like 2,000 annotations, and we begin to, in this case, inductively code for established knowledge construction categories, things like interpretation, asking questions, coming to consensus, having productive conflict, that we do find evidence, including patterns of these practices, not only within courses, but across courses, that show us that annotations can be productive. So yes, it is fun and necessary to kind of argue with an author on your own in the margins of your personal book. I get that. I do it myself. It's very important. And when annotation becomes social in a classroom context with people who are in a kind of socially organized, dare I say, designed environment, it also can, in this case, mediate knowledge construction. And our most recent research is showing that that's the case.
Dr. Remi, I have a question. So while you were giving a presentation, you mentioned that like one of the like drawback or of this is like basically it's the personal notes to us ourselves, writing, trying to reflect what we are understanding. So
Yeah.
sometimes I have seen like we have mentioned Twitter and all those kind of stuff. Like when we do annotation, like the whatever we are trying to communicate, it doesn't actually reflect that. So is there any proper way to write annotation that will reflect the meaning that I'm trying to communicate?
Yeah, that's a really, thank you. That's a really important point, because, often we lose nuance, right? And particularly in social media, we also lose context, right? And this, of course, can be, as we know, probably weaponized in very partisan ways, right? Where a statement, whether it is annotation or it's just, again, someone saying something, gets just, just gets, things get taken out of context. Things, again, get turned into harm. And so I have to say, I don't have a kind of like back pocket easy answer to what you're saying, because as a scholar, I see this happen all the time. I intend to say something in a paper that I write, I publish it, and then somebody takes it in a totally different direction, or takes it out of context. I think that we see in a lot of cases, particularly for folks who are maybe in teacher education, or who know quite a bit about just the nuts and bolts of teaching and learning, we see examples like this where discourses around things like grit or mindset, right? Growth mindset, or even design work. And I know that some of you have, and then this is how I was trained, in design-based research, right? That these methods, that these ideas, the intent of those is taken out of context. And so, your question is so important, because I don't think that annotation is any less susceptible to that problem. I don't think that annotation somehow circumvents the challenge that what I say is going to somehow have its intended meaning always conveyed all the time to everybody who reads what I write. What I do find useful is that annotation as a social practice can allow communities to discuss how to make sense of the intent of those words, right? And how annotation can open a door for groups of people to together try and figure out what somebody perhaps meant, or why interpretations that may be different are equally valid, right? And again, because I love their work, and I think it's just so both technically sophisticated, but also really well done. Here's another example from again, this project that is looking at, studies of the Caribbean. In this case, it's a 1707 voyage to the islands of Madeira, Barbados, Naves, St. Christopher's, Jamaica, right? And here's this incredible example of scholars taking these original source texts. And in this case, this is multimodal. There's music in this example, but also public open annotation to try and, I think, maybe reinterpret that initial intent. But your question's spot on. It's a tough one. That's the best I got.
Dr. Remi? Hi, Dr. Remi.
Hey.
Hi. So my question is, how do I encourage students to annotate and at the same time also promote creativity? So so I'm trying to find out, are there boundaries? Yeah, is there like a limit, or are there some things they need to know that they shouldn't do while annotating, or do I just encourage them to be creative?
Yeah, what a lovely question. I'll start by saying that, I teach classes every semester. I'm a teacher as well, and some of my students also struggle. I'm this big advocate of annotation, and some of my students are like, forget it, I don't want to do it. And so I want to never force my students to use a technology that they don't want to use, or to use it in a way that they don't feel comfortable doing so. Particularly if we're thinking to your question about being creative, expanding interpretation, thinking again about ways in which we might critique or push back or contest the claims of an author. I want to invite that kind of dialogue. I don't want to shut it down. And so a very first step that I have with many students is to say, do you like annotating by hand? Do you want to annotate digitally? And some students, they really want to annotate first by themselves, and they want to do so on paper, or they want to do so with colored markers. And so, if we need to print out readings, if we need to make copies of texts available in a material way, physically, I think it's a really good entry point. And then saying, maybe identifying 2 or 3 annotations that then might get translated into a digital form and then shared socially with other people. So that's one way just of trying to honor students wherever they may be as they take part in this new kind of social practice. But your point about creativity as well, because annotation now is digital, some annotation, again, software allows for very creative interpretations of annotation. So for example, again, people know that I use this tool hypothesis quite a bit in my own teaching and learning. And so we can embed videos. We can embed links to other research, other resources. We can also embed GIFs, animated, little pictures that we all love online. And so we can have entire classroom discussions about a particular selection, a passage, a chapter of a text, and have it be entirely visual, entirely GIF-based. And that to me shows the creative possibilities of, in this case, digital and social annotation. I can't necessarily draw well in a small margins of my book by myself. But if I have a GIF that I think interprets some particular point in the text, I can easily drop a link into, in this case, a digital annotation program, and then have peers reply in humorous and in complimentary ways. So that's perhaps one way of getting at the inviting creativity that I hope is at the heart of, your question.
What if you can share a little bit more about hypothesis? When I think of hypothesis, what I'm thinking about is collaborative annotation. When I think of that, I think in terms of really much more of a global rather than classroom or national. Can you just maybe share a little bit about your experience there and whether or not annotation always has to be collaborative?
No, actually, it doesn't always have to be collaborative, but it absolutely can be global and inviting and more open. and not necessarily tied to a classroom. And so in this case, there is a particular tool that we've mentioned a few times now called Hypothesis. And the core technology is free and it's open and it's used in a variety of kind of public and open educational projects. I want to highlight, and I just put this into the chat, one that's happening right now, which is that you may be aware that the United Nations through UNESCO published a recommendation about open educational resources. And so right now, in a kind of long-term way, groups of educators are publicly annotating the OER recommendation from UNESCO. And so they're using this free technology, this free annotation technology Hypothesis. They're actually using it with, in this case, an open book that's hosted off of Pressbook, so an open text. And in this particular case, which I think is also really compelling, you have this recommendation translated into French and Spanish and Russian and Arabic and Chinese. And so now educators who speak those languages from anywhere on the planet can access this open text, can use a free technology, and can add their thoughts on the future of OER and open education to this as a public resource. So to me, that's a very inviting example of what this can look like, particularly as mediated by open technologies, and is a useful example also that shows that it can be collaborative in some instances. In other cases, it might be just a resource that folks want to read as they are engaging with this particular text. And thank you, Nate, in the chat for adding in another resource here about this. It's a really interesting example right now that's happening literally this week. So, and next week, and whenever you want to jump in.
No matter how long I've been using Zoom, I still forget to unmute when it's my turn. We're coming up to the end of our session, so I don't want to leave anybody out. If anybody has a question, you can type it in the question panel. You can type it in the chat. You can open your mic and ask the question. We have about another 2 or so minutes before we release Dr. Remi from. Let's see, me. That's a very good, very good suggestion, Nate. And our program does a lot of work around OER, and actually, in our whole master's program, we only have one class that does not use an open textbook. All of our courses uses open OER, and the only reason why we have that unopened book is because the students keep requesting that we keep it. So otherwise, all of our courses run on OER, either what we have created ourselves or what we source and curate from different sources. So, well,
I'm going to drop just one more link in the chat, just to have folks look at it. Coming out of some colleagues, in England, this particular article that I just put in the chat, I think does a nice job of describing the shift to social and collaborative annotation, particularly in the COVID context. And so again, a lot of folks might be experimenting with online teaching and learning for the first time or in just different circumstances. And so if, again, social annotation in this context, in this kind of new pandemic era, piques your interest, I think this is a nice, approachable, essentially case study of an instructor who made that move and what that looks like using a different technology, in this case, a technology called Talus Elevate, which is just, again, another annotation platform. But I think it's a nice complement to the literature. So one more piece in a very big puzzle.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Remi, let me give it back to you with any closing remarks for us.
It's an honor, folks. Please, if you have lingering questions that pop into your head tomorrow or a week from now or a month from now, I'm pretty easy to find online. I love chatting about all of this. And so particularly I know we had a lot of doc students with us today, and again, that's my bread and butter as well, working with doc students in my programs as well. So whether you have questions about research, how this might look in terms of, inclusion in the study, you want to chat methods, you want to chat data analysis, whatever might be on your mind, look into my work. Please reach out with questions. It was really an honor to join all of you today. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much. We really appreciate the conversation. We are going to post the video onto our website, and especially if you came in a little bit later, you can take a look at what you missed at the beginning. But just fantastic engagement. Remi, you know I value your work and admire the work that you're doing. So I really appreciate that you were able to come here and be with us. So with that, I just want to say thank you, everybody, whether you're watching this later or whether you're here now. Thank you for participating. Here are my takeaway from the session. I'm going to summarize what I heard, right? Annotation leaves a trace. Annotation can be a protest. Annotation is a note added to a text. It is intertextual, multimodal, dialogic, counter-narrative. It is a form of participation, but most of all, it's an everyday practice. So with that, thank you everybody for being here, and join us again next month, the last Wednesday of May, for the next speaker series. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.